Before we begin, I want to recognize the retirement of our longtime dear friend, Chief Clerk Darla Rybczynski. Darla has combined 20 years of service in the Senate, and for the last 9 years, Darla has worked tirelessly behind the scenes of this committee, running all of our operations. Her hard work, day in and day out, is the backbone of what allows the committee to do our work, and we have done a lot of it. I know I speak for all the members and each staff member here, past and present, over the last decade. And when I say thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts for everything that you have done for us and for your service to the nation, Darla, to say you're going to be missed is an understatement. To say that we can't replace you is accurate. But thank you, and I know we're going to work hard to that. So now, I turn it to Senator Barrasso.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would like to add to your remarks and thank you, Darla, for a remarkable time here, not just in this committee, but on Capitol Hill and service to the country. 9 years at the committee, 2 decades in the Senate, leaving very big shoes to fill. Your Capitol Hill career actually started in 1997 when you were the office manager and chief clerk in the Committee of Governmental Affairs. Then became chief clerk and security manager for that committee. Later worked at the administrative director for Senate Majority Leader's office at the time under the leadership of former Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle, and then under the late Senator Harry Reid. And you joined this committee in 2013. You've been here ever since. You know, if you take a look, Mr. Chairman, she is committed to ensuring everything here runs smoothly. And it really has. Your dedication to keeping the committee on schedule is incredible. I'm thankful for your expertise in managing the day-to-day operation of our committee, for serving as a liaison between the executive branch and each senator on this committee. You're going to be greatly missed, and I will miss you in your retirement and wish you the very, very best.
Darla, now as a token of our appreciation, we have something to commemorate your time with us and the Senate at large and all your contributions to our great nation. Right in the middle, darling. Okay. Here you go. Here it is. This is your, and everybody signed it for you.
Thank you.
Here, John.
Great. Good. Everybody look here for a couple more. Perfect. Thank you.
You even had to write on the back.
Is that the same?
Thank you.
Did you note that the people who stood were staff members? They were terrific.
They know who runs the place.
Yes, they do.
Now we're going to turn to our hearing today, and this morning we'll be discussing the Department of Interior's implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I'd like to welcome and thank Tommy Boudreau, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Interior, for appearing before the committee today. Last year, Congress worked in a bipartisan way to enact the largest federal investments in our nation's infrastructure in decades, including approximately $100 billion in authorization and funding for the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy. This, combined with the investments provided in the Inflation Reduction Act, will be game-changing for us to produce more energy, lead the world in innovation, onshore supply chains, clean up legacy pollution, address drought, plan for wildland fires, and more. Last July, we held a very thorough business meeting about these provisions in our jurisdiction, which we considered 74 amendments and agreed to 48 before reporting our position of the bill with the bipartisan support. And as I understand, we might have been the only committee that worked the entire bill through this process. Now that the bipartisan infrastructure bill has been law for just shy of 13 months, we're here today to discuss how the Department of the Interior has been implementing the authorization and the $28.1 billion that we provided you. I am especially proud that $16 billion of that funding will be specifically helped to address an issue very important to my home state of West Virginia, the reclamation of abandoned coal mine lands and the plugging of orphan wells. Over $1.2 billion has already gone out the door to carry out that work. Working together with Interior, states are investing in projects to document and plug orphan wells. They close dangerous mine shafts, reclaim unstable slopes, restore water supplies, and clean streams by treating acid mine drainage, all while providing local jobs in those communities. Coal communities in West Virginia and across the country are proud to have powered our nation for decades and enabled this country to become the superpower of the world. Last year's funding investments recognize those contributions and the scars these communities bear as a result, and provide the funding needed to reinvest in the future of these communities that gave us so much. In fact, with the department's help, oh boy, the infrastructure bill's abandoned mine land funding, coupled with the AML fee extension, could result in approximately $4.3 billion in economic output for the state and 1,730 jobs that will continue for 13 to 15 years in my state of West Virginia. Substantial investments were also made to put men and women to work in our nation's forests to make them healthier and less prone to wildfires. And at the Bureau of Reclamation, we made historic investments to address the ongoing drought crisis in the West, a key focus for many of our members on this committee. The law also recognized the importance of onshoring our nation's critical mineral supply chain and reducing our reliance on bad actors abroad to provide our energy needs, something that we doubled down on in the Inflation Reduction Act this summer. In addition to historic supply chain investments, we provided the Department of Energy in the bipartisan infrastructure law. We also came together to accelerate mineral mapping and fund crucial facilities and research at the U.S. Geological Survey, work that will help us find new mineral deposits and develop the sustainable mines of the future. Due to the severity of our energy and mineral security challenge, we included aggressive deadlines for action in our legislation. Unfortunately, not all of these deadlines have been met, including at the Department of Interior. Senator Murkowski and I sent letters to Secretary Haaland, along with the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Energy, the Director of National Intelligence, back in May, after several deadlines related to the critical minerals were missed. While many of those issues were eventually resolved, last month the Department of Interior failed to meet our another key deadline related to critical minerals, a first step required to improve permitting for new mines. And there are more statutory deadlines coming soon for reports that are needed to inform efforts to secure our supply chains and increase our energy security. In addition, the one-year deadline to get regulations in place for new authority to permit carbon sequestration on the outer continental shelf also came and went on November the 15th. I look forward to hearing more about how we can work with Interior to move forward on these issues and at the same time ensure the future obligations will be met, of which there are many, many left. The subsequent Inflation Reduction Act mandated specific oil and gas lease sales and take place over the next year, create a new requirement that oil and gas leasing take place before the renewable leasing and right of ways are issued, and numerous projects of all kinds are awaiting permits. With all of these deadlines looming and actions to be taken from these two historic laws, it is crucial that we have some assurances that the Department of the Interior will get back on track, meet its statutory deadlines, and move with urgencies that the situation requires and the American people deserve. Now I'm going to turn to my colleague and friend, Senator Barrasso, for his opening statement.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding today's hearing. In November of 2021, Congress passed a $415 billion spending bill. It's been called an infrastructure bill, but in reality, the legislation also lavished billions of taxpayer dollars on programs that have absolutely nothing to do with infrastructure. The Congressional Budget Office has said that this legislation will increase our nation's deficits by $256 billion over the next 10 years. And we now know that this legislation, along with a much larger partisan Democrat spending bills, contributed to the highest inflation in our nation in the last 40 years. Under this legislation, Congress appropriated over $28 billion to the Department of Interior. That is nearly twice the amount of, and in addition to, the department's annual budget of $14.5 billion. So I'm glad we have an opportunity to hear from the Deputy Secretary today. I'm interested in learning what, if any, controls and protocols the department has put in place to ensure it doesn't waste taxpayer dollars. Also like to know whether the department has taken any steps to reduce the inflationary impact that this massive spending bill has on communities across the country. Annual inflation is still above 7%. Energy inflation is still above 13%. Americans are continuing to suffer from higher energy prices and higher food prices. And President Biden continues to sit on his hands. He's been in office for nearly 2 years. Under the Mineral Leasing Act, the Secretary of Interior is required to hold lease sales in each state with oil and gas resources. In other words, the Secretary was required to hold at least a total of 8 lease sales in each of these states over the last 2 years. Quarterly lease sales, 2 years, 8 sales. But the Secretary has held only a single lease sale in these states during that time, ignoring the law. To make matters worse, the Department has indicated that it will hold only 1 lease sale next year. Now, under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, the Secretary was required to hold 3 offshore oil and gas lease sales this year. Instead, the Secretary canceled those lease sales in May, again in violation of the law. The Secretary was also required to issue a final 5-year leasing plan at the end of June. The Secretary not only missed the deadline, she has issued a draft plan that considers ending offshore oil and gas leasing altogether. It's not what the law says. So, Mr. Deputy Secretary, last year you publicly stated that your objective is to, quote, fundamentally change these programs to get us on a path to decarbonizing public lands. I'm deeply troubled by that belief that you can fundamentally change the oil and natural gas leasing programs that are in law, which Congress has established as a federal law. And I'm equally troubled that you think that decarbonizing public lands is a goal of these programs, because it is not. Since taking office, President Biden has gone hat in hand to some of the world's worst dictators, begging them to produce more oil. And that includes going specifically to Vladimir Putin in Russia before the invasion of Ukraine, specifically going in person to Saudi Arabia, going to Iran, gone to Venezuela. And each of these dictators have rejected his request. Meanwhile, U.S. crude oil production is still 1 million barrels a day below pre-pandemic levels. Each and every day, 1 million barrels a day production less. And the Department is ignoring federal law as it tries to end oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters. American families are hurting. Gasoline is still a heck of a lot higher than the day Joe Biden came into office, in spite of releasing 1 million barrels a day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, of our emergency reserve, 1 million barrels a day for the last 6 months, 180 million barrels. Diesel is still 76% higher than when Joe Biden took office. Just last week, it was $2 a gallon more in Wyoming than regular gasoline. In addition, America's electricity and natural gas bills rapidly increasing. The Department needs to stop blocking access to America's oil and gas resources, needs to follow the law, put the interests of the American people first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Now, Mr. Boudreau will have your comments.
Thank you very much, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, all of the members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to provide this update to the committee on the Department of the Interior's implementation of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This bipartisan law is a key part of the President's plan to rebuild our country. It is a once-in-a-generation investment that is helping tackle the climate crisis, create jobs, advance environmental justice, and boost local economies. Under Secretary Haaland's leadership, we have been working hard to implement these important investments in an effective, efficient way, while also taking care of our responsibility as stewards of these very substantial taxpayer funds. We are charged with protecting America's great outdoors, powering our nation's future, protecting and managing America's natural resources and cultural heritage, and providing scientific information about all of these resources. We also have the honor of our trust responsibilities and special commitments to American Indians, Alaska Natives, and affiliated island communities. This historic law has enabled us to grow our capabilities and better advance all of these critical missions. The Department's leadership is mindful of the scope of this task, and we take our responsibility to use these resources entrusted to us in the law wisely. As was pointed out, this is more than $30 billion, almost double the Department's annual budget. Our bureaus and offices administer financial assistance programs and carry out activities in 8 key program areas under this law, including, as the chairman mentioned, our abandoned mine land reclamation and orphan well programs, water infrastructure, Indian rights settlements, wildland fire preparedness, fuels management, and post-fire rehabilitation, ecosystem restoration and resilience, scientific innovation and mapping, and tribal infrastructure projects and climate resiliency initiatives. Let me provide just a few highlights of our implementation thus far. A year ago, we welcomed Winnie Steckelberg, who is accompanying us at this hearing today, to join the department as our senior advisor and infrastructure coordinator. Winnie has been instrumental in standing up our organizational infrastructure to do infrastructure. This includes establishing cross-functional teams and project management offices across the range of programmatic and administrative functions to implement and coordinate these significant investments. We've hired staff across the department to work in existing as well as the newly created program offices and have established important stakeholder partnerships to help us implement the law. We have hosted dozens of stakeholder meetings and formally consulted with tribes. And we have put in place a public-facing website to ensure that all of our information is easily available to the public. In fiscal year 2022, we announced $6.4 billion in infrastructure projects, and we have funded nearly 1,000 of those projects, putting billions of dollars to work in support of our mission to serve communities and to meet our obligations under the law. Part of the reason why I'm very happy to be with you this morning is that I take every opportunity I can to thank Congress for the investments made possible through both the IIJA and the Inflation Reduction Act. Along with the Secretary and the Interior Department leadership, I travel across the country and I've spoken with governors, mayors, and people on the landscape about the dramatic impacts that these pieces of historic legislation are having to improve the lives of Americans and to protect and restore our critical infrastructure and natural ecosystems. I look forward to sharing those conversations with you, and again, thank you for these investments. Together, we are proving that to the American people that government can be made to work for them, and that we are accomplishing a great deal through these partnerships. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and committee members, thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, sir. We're going to start with our questions now, and I've got a few, and I'll get started, and then we'll go right through our list today, but there's quite a few. The bipartisan infrastructure bill did quite a few things and directed it, and one of them was the ability to produce cleaner energy anywhere else than they do in the world. That's our main goal. To get that done, we need to stop wasteful natural gas flaring and vetting and all the different things that we do with methane. The infrastructure law provided DOI with the authority to accelerate permitting for gathering pipelines. I understand the reason that we weren't taking that methane off is because we couldn't do the pipelines to take it from the wellhead back to market. And so they were flaring it and it was damned if you do and damned if you don't, and couldn't get to the market. So what have you all been able to do? Because when you implement the gathering line permitting authority from this bill, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, that should have happened. Has those permits started so you can remove that methane from being at vetting or flared into the air?
Thank you very much, Senator Manchin. Agree completely that part of the solution to prevent the waste of natural gas resources, which again, when we're talking about public lands, belong to the American taxpayer, is an infrastructure question. And establishing gathering lines to collect that gas and bring it to central facilities and ultimately to market is part of the solution. And so appreciate very much the new authority under the infrastructure law to facilitate the permitting of gathering lines. part of, and this is, part of the broader story with respect to bill implementation, is making adjustments both in our process and as well as with operators. And so we
Has there
have.
been any permits for any?
Yeah, we've had some examples,
I think
including
North Dakota's a
Colorado's.
big, I think North Dakota, Senator Hoven can speak probably more to this than I can, but I'm understanding they've done a lot of flaring up there, and they have a lot of vetting going on, venting, if you will. Have they started getting some permits to move the methane off?
So part of it is working with operators to adjust to the new opportunity, but we have seen examples of using this categorical exclusion to permit gas.
Let me say this with my time left. First of all, the bills that we have done, and I know especially the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has been touted as a environment bill, basically a enviro bill. And I think for people to know what that bill really did, it was an all-in energy policy, basically, that you cannot do one without the other. So the Mineral Leasing Act already required quarterly oil and gas sales for onshore. The Inflation Reduction Act mandated certain offshore lease sales over the next year. The president makes a comment and says basically that there will be no more drilling. If there's no more drilling, there's no more wind, there's no more solar, there's no more anything. And that's why the two are tied together, but no one really knows that because no one has touted as an all-in energy policy. And so I don't know how you all comply with that if you're hearing from the administration that no more drilling, but on the other hand, it's unable to do wind or solar leasing or rights of way without first doing oil and gas leasing. That's in the bill. That was in the bill. So I've been happy to see that you all reinstated the Gulf sale from last year, and we'll be going forward with the mandated lease sales this coming year. So I don't know how you all are navigating that and where your direction has been, or is that just a misstatement?
So we very much view, as laid out in the IRA, our renewable energy programs, both onshore and offshore, as well as our oil and gas leasing programs, as connected.
You all understand how it's connected, that basically it's an all-in energy policy. We're going to do the fossil in the cleanest fashion possible to provide the energy we need today while we're investing in energy that we'll need for the future.
That's exactly how we view it.
Okay. The bipartisan infrastructure law took large steps to address the critical minerals and our vulnerability in the supply chains through the smart investments and requiring Interior to improve the mine permitting process. Can you commit to addressing these overdue items in a timely fashion to get back on track? Because I'm understanding we still have critical mineral projects, lithium mines that are still on hold forever. Have they been moving in a positive way? Have you basically have any of them that have been through the permitting process or going to be starting production anytime soon in the United States?
With respect to the reports called for under the bipartisan infrastructure law, those are in progress. I chair the interagency working group along with the Energy Department, very focused on these issues.
A very short timeline that we're trying to get back in production so that we can meet the needs of the market. And right now we're depending on China.
Yeah, and with respect to lithium projects on public lands, there are a couple significant projects in front of us, both in Nevada, that are moving forward, and you're going to see announcements on those in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Senator Barrasso.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boudreaux, in June of this year, President Biden said, quote, "Republicans falsely claim that I'm blocking production on federal lands." He says, but again, that's nonsense. Well, I'm a Republican, and I do claim that he is blocking production on federal lands. Last month, President Biden said something different. He said, no more drilling. There is no more drilling. Joe Biden. When was he lying? Which was the lie? Because clearly the president is lying. Which one?
So, Senator, I think, as you know, production on public lands, both onshore and offshore, has not stopped. In fact, in this administration, production levels, and this is just EIA information, has increased on public lands to over 1 billion barrels a year. And so there has been no attempt by the administration to block or stop or impede production on public lands.
So then the president is lying when he says no more drilling, there is no more drilling. That's a direct lie into the camera to the American people by the president of the United States.
So I don't, I can't comment on a quote sort of out of context, but clearly there is ongoing drilling on public lands as well as production.
Okay. So under the Mineral Leasing Act, the Secretary is required to hold quarterly lease sales in each state with federal oil and gas resources. By the fall of 2023, 2.5 years into the administration, the Secretary will have held 2 of the 10 required sales in these states. So when will the department resume quarterly lease sales in the states where federal and oil gas resources are currently?
So part of what I appreciate about the bipartisan infrastructure law and now the IRA is that it does lay out a clear path, as we discussed with Senator Manchin, for our oil and gas leasing programs. That requires a period of adjustment to comply with the law, but we are moving forward with onshore leasing through the BLM in association with our renewable energy programs on public lands as well.
So I would remind you that a federal court has directed the Secretary to comply with the Mineral Leasing Act. And I'm beginning to question whether the administration believes that it's in the rule of law, because it's not behaving that way. Another question. The department recently released a draft analysis of greenhouse gas emissions associated with 3,600 oil and gas leases issued from 2015 to 2020. Until the department finalizes this analysis, thousands of leases and permits remain in limbo. When will the department issue a final environmental assessment of this matter?
So this is one of the highest priorities in the department to complete that work. As I know you're aware, we get buffeted around by various pieces of litigation and judicial rulings, and so part of what we have to do while we complete that analysis is take into account the latest judicial rulings that impact that analysis. And so in order to again, provide defensibility for leases that the department issues, we have to ensure that that work complies with the latest court rulings.
So you're saying basically a lot of lawsuits slow down the process, muck up the problem. In addition to the red tape, the lawsuits make it worse. So does the department have a plan? Yeah, go ahead.
No, that is true.
Okay. Does the department have a plan to apply the final assessment to the 3,600 leases so it can issue drilling permits in a timely manner?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Finally, in July, the Secretary released a proposed offshore oil and gas leasing plan for 2023 to 2028. One option the Secretary is considering is to offer no leases during the entire 5-year time period. I'd remind you that the federal oil production accounts for 27% of all U.S. oil production. We're 1 million barrels a day behind where we should be at this point. How can the department justify ending offshore oil and gas lease sales when President Biden continues to beg overseas dictators for more oil?
Again, as we discussed with the chairman, under the IRA, our oil and gas leasing programs are connected with our offshore wind programs. What you saw in step 2 of a 3-step process in development of a new 5-year leasing program is simply a statement of the range of possibilities from no lease sales under the Secretary's authority to essentially the same number of lease sales that was included in the previous 5-year plan completed at the end of the Obama administration.
So to follow up on the issue of the Infrastructure Act, under the Infrastructure Act, Congress appropriated over $28 billion to the Department of Interior. This is nearly twice the amount of, in addition to, the annual budget of about $14.5 billion. The Democrats' Partisan Inflation Act appropriated another $6.6 billion to the department, staggering amount of money. What new controls and protocols has the department put in place to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse of this spending?
Absolutely, and as I think you've heard, the administration, including the president himself, has placed an extremely high priority on ensuring controls and prevention of waste, fraud, and abuse, and the implementation of both of these bills. We take that extremely seriously. I meet with our Inspector General every other week to talk about a host of issues, including their programs, and they have new funding under the legislation as well, to work with us to ensure that there are appropriate safeguards. And we're also being mindful about economies of scale as we make these investments to ensure that the taxpayer gets full value from, again, these transformative investments under both of these pieces of legislation.
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act included a relatively robust amount of spending that Republicans, many Republicans supported on the floor. But I want to back up to a previous piece of legislation that passed under the previous administration and previous Congress, which is the Great American Outdoors Act that was passed in 2020. And Mr. Boudreaux, I want you to walk us through that bill's implementation in fiscal years 21 and fiscal year 22. Specifically, there were two parts to that bill. There was the funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund at what is considered full funding levels, as well as the National Parks and Public Lands Legacy Restoration Fund, which was an attempt to catch up on infrastructure that had been ignored for decades by the Congress. So walk us through implementation in fiscal year 21 and 22 for both of those programs, and what percentage of the funding that was approved by Congress made it onto the ground in both of those categories in each of those fiscal years.
So very happy to provide, as I think we have publicly, specific detail on implementation in both of those years. To describe our overall process, we go through a rigorous bottom-up process to identify areas where investments in order to address the backlog can have.
Yeah, I'm not questioning the process. I just want to understand what percentage of the funding allocated made it onto the ground in each of those categories in each of those fiscal years. So if 900 million, okay.
Very happy to do that.
So what you're telling me is you don't have it at your fingertips, but you'll get it to us. Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk about water. There's been an enormous amount of concern about the Colorado River Basin. That is fully appropriate. We are effectively using more water every single year than we have produced in that basin at this point. What has gotten less national attention is the Rio Grande Basin, but more than 40% of the Rio Grande Basin experienced exceptional drought in 2022, following decades of permanent, in my view, aridification, and at a time of rising demand for water resources throughout that basin. So walk me through how the Department of Interior plans to allocate funds from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as from the Inflation Reduction Act, to address the urgent need for sustainable water resources in the Rio Grande Basin.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And you're quite right. There is a lot of focus, justifiably so, on the Colorado River Basin. That said, the Rio Grande is one of our highest priorities as well. And so we bring to bear the entire suite of tools that we have within the Bureau of Reclamation, including under, investments to address drought and water infrastructure under both of these laws, but also our existing programs, including Water Smart. I traveled to Mexico in October, had conversations along with former Secretary Salazar with ConAgra about these issues, and we're carrying forward those conversations with Mexico because they're key partners on Rio Grande, as well as with the State Department that helps administer dams on the Rio Grande.
Can you walk us through what the most effective tools that you have to be able to reduce pressure on the system, what you found to work in sort of order of priority, whether that's Water Smart, whether that's leasing, all of the different things you're using to try and balance supply and demand in this current situation?
Yeah, so one of the most effective tools we have, and both of these pieces of legislation provide resources for it, is to increase water efficiency within the system. And so making investments at the irrigation district, the water conservation district level on straightforward issues like lining canals and working with irrigators to wring additional wet water out of the system is one of our highest priorities to get long-term benefits out of these bills.
Thank you. And I just want to bring us back to the fact that it is directly because of our dependence on fossil fuel and the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere that we have this devastating, and I mean devastating, economically devastating situation across the West. So while there has been an attempt by some to lead and by some not to lead on that issue, we are dealing with the reality of climate change each and every day. Our farmers, our tribes, our cities. And so thank you to the Department of Interior for at least recognizing how great a threat that is to our way of life across the West.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Boudreaux, good to see you again. Thanks for your service to the nation and the task that you take on. I do need to run through several different issues with you. The infrastructure bill itself required the Department of Interior and the Forest Service to work on improving the efficiency of permitting. This has already been discussed already, that there were some required reports that were to come out to say, what are we going to do to improve permitting, especially for critical minerals and mining and other things on that as well. That report was due by November the 15th of this year. Has that report been released yet?
The report hasn't been released yet.
When is that coming?
It will be out early next year.
So define early for me. Is
The
this
first quarter of next year, it'll be complete.
great? We will be watching for that. Obviously, that's a major piece to be able to work on the permitting activities and what can be done. There was also a request for some recommendations in that report as well to say, here's some things that we need to be able to improve the permitting process on this as well. I and several other senators had also sent a letter to the Department of Interior to be able to ask on some of the issues on flaring that's already come up. Miraculously, that letter has not been answered in months, and then it came in last night. So it's always helpful to be able to have a hearing and to be able to go through and to actually get some of the mail that came in. So when that letter came in last night, there were a couple of things on this, because one is there is the infrastructure bill itself also gives to the Department of Interior the right to be able to do categorical exclusions, to be able to go through some of the process on permitting. The letter itself, let me just read you this section because you may not have read the letter from last night. It said the Bureau of Land Management is implementing Section 11318 of the infrastructure bill through review of rights-of-way and sundry notices submitted by operators for gathering lines and associated field compression of pumping units, and may apply the categorical exclusion, if applicable, when processing the authorization. Help me understand when that categorical exclusion may be used.
Yeah, and as I touched on in the discussion with Chairman Manchin, part of the process to increase usage of this new authority is working with operators so that they're aware of it. Currently, we evaluate gathering lines in connection with an existing APD process, and so it gets subsumed within that. Part of our outreach is to say, with respect to specific gathering lines, we do have this new authority to, under the law, to apply a categorical exclusion. And so we've seen some operators start to take that up. There are a few examples, but again, part of it is to advertise that we have the authority so folks can take advantage of it.
So has that authority been used at all yet by anyone, or been given it to anyone?
Yes.
You're saying that some operators are aware of it, they have made the request, has it actually been given?
Yes. On at least one occasion in Colorado, it has been used.
Okay. Is there clear guidelines of when it will be used so that when operators request it, they'll know here are the guidelines for, to use this categorical exclusion?
Yes, and I'll confirm with the BLM that instructions have been provided to the field offices along those lines, but BLM is aware of this authority under the IRA.
Right. Well, obviously, we're aware of it. You're aware of it. I want to make sure operators are not only aware of it, but know how to be able to actually get access to it. This issue of flaring is exceptionally important to us. We'd rather be able to sell that resource worldwide, as much of Europe is clamoring for that resource, rather than have it burned off. The way to be able to get access to it are these gathering lines. And so the more that we can literally gather, the more that we can bring the price down here for Americans and also provide that resource internationally as well.
Agree completely.
Let me ask you a little bit about the Earth Survey mapping resource that there's been literally millions of dollars have been put out on that. Give us an update of where that mapping is going for what minerals that we actually have here in the United States.
Again, that process is ongoing through the U.S. Geological Survey, but it is one of the most valuable investments being made under these pieces of legislation to support states, operators, as well as provide our agencies with the ability to identify resource and engage in deconfliction and accelerate the production.
When do you think that'll be complete?
Next year.
So by December next year, do you think it's a certain quarter? When do you think it may be complete?
Again, it's a high priority. It's also an enormous undertaking,
Yeah, it is.
as I think you appreciate.
Right. Well, it is, and it's one of the things that we've talked about a lot of how to actually do mineral production here in the United States, identifying them, prioritizing them when you do the mining here and the processing here. I know that the Biden administration has allocated some resources through their minerals partnership to literally giving millions of dollars to other countries to be able to identify critical minerals in mining, but we have that here. In Nevada, there's a wide spread of lithium that's there that we know is there, and we're just looking for more priority on how do we actually get to that processing and mining here rather than actually doing it overseas. We're going to need both, but we want to make sure that it's actually getting done here as well. Mr. Boudreaux, thank you.
Understand.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator King.
Thank you, Senator. I think before we go into this discussion, we should acknowledge, given the mandate of our committee, the incredible potential breakthrough at Lawrence Livermore National Labs this weekend, where there was a net production of energy from nuclear fusion. Two things about that. Number one, this could be literally world-changing in the most profound way. Number two, it came about at one of our national labs, funded through the United States government and the activities of this committee. I think that's something we should recognize and celebrate.
If I could add one more thing to that so I don't take away from your time at all. I'd had a chance to go to ITER in southern France, and it is unbelievable. But what this 37 nations are all involved in this, and we are part of it. This could unleash the ability that people who are in disagreement will have to find other reasons to fight a war other than energy. And it's just unbelievable what it's going to unleash. And we've seen the major, it's a 500 megawatt fusion. You're seeing the concept. They have a full production. It'll be a production as far as on a grand scale, not just as far as in theory, at smaller scales. So we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Mr. Boudreaux, under the infrastructure bill, there was funding for transportation support for national parks and some of the backlog of maintenance. That's good. I appreciate that. What bothered me is the administration's budget for maintenance in the national parks was inadequate. The general rule of thumb is 2 to 4% of capital value for maintenance every year. I think the budget this year is about 1%. That's not an indictment of this administration. That's been the pattern for the past 25 or 30 years. That's how we got into this hole. This committee and the Congress worked very hard on the Great American Outdoors Act to tackle the maintenance backlog, but it's pretty frustrating to see that we're still digging the hole. So I hope you'll take back to the department the point that we can't expect Congress to come to the rescue of the maintenance backlog every 4 or 5 years if indeed the budget is inadequate and makes the hole deeper every 4 or 5 years. Do you take my point?
No, thank you, and thank you for your leadership and partnership on these issues. I will definitely take that back, including to OMB.
Another provision of the bill which has been discussed, the chairman discussed, is capping wells. How are you prioritizing where we cap? And for example, methane is the low-hanging fruit of climate change. To what extent are we prioritizing capping wells where there are methane leaks?
Thank you. Again, this is one of the most exciting programs that we have under the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so we have prioritized getting initial funding grants out to all of the states in order to address high-priority wells. And we've also put forward guidance and are implementing additional state-level grants in order to provide those investments around high-priority wells. And one of the aspects of the guidelines is addressing legacy emissions, including methane emissions and other forms of pollution
So
from these
there is
wells.
an effort being made to prioritize.
Absolutely. And states like New Mexico, believe me, they know the problem wells.
Now, another area of increased funding has been in the Inflation Reduction Act for staffing at the national parks. And I wanted to inquire if the department is moving toward implementation. Senator Daines and I have called for 23,000 FTEs at the national parks because we're having a huge increase in visitation, and in fact, we have lower staffing than we had 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. Do you have a hiring plan, and will you be able to get to the 23,000 figure in the reasonably foreseeable future?
Yeah, and thank you again for these investments. And the Park Service has developed internal guidance and hiring plan directed towards this summer. As you know, Senator, the largest demand period and largest stress on our national parks is during the summer season.
Last summer, we had 4 million people at Acadia National Park in Maine.
Yeah, absolutely. And so part of our strategy to take advantage of these resources is focused on seasonal hiring in the coming year, and the Park Service has developed guidance disseminated to the parks for exactly that purpose.
Final question, this came up in one of our earlier hearings. There's some money allocated in the Inflation Reduction Act for developing solar projects over canals, over waterways, which has a double benefit because a lot of the problem in the West is caused by evaporation. And if you have solar panels resting on top of the water surface, you can generate electricity and avoid excessive evaporation. Any update on the utilization of those funds?
Yeah, and again, this is part of what's exciting about the legislation is that type of innovation. So there's about $25 million devoted to exactly this, and we're working through design, study, and implementation for pilot projects to demonstrate precisely the benefits that you described. And so, yes, we're taking advantage of that funding and identifying the pilot projects.
Thank you. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to share a couple of charts with my friend, the senator from Wyoming, on inflation that indicates that, yes, indeed, federal spending contributes about 0.1% of the inflation, according to Moody's Analytics, and also a comparison of our inflation rate to those of other OECD countries, which shows virtually identical, which indicates that it's hard to argue that spending in our Congress has caused inflation that's happening in France, Japan, and South Korea. Thank you.
I think ours is around 7.1.
I'll pass those on to Senator Barrasso for his edification.
Well, the chairman is correct in terms of what the numbers are out today, and it's still a 40-year high for American families who are suffering, and it's not just the cost at Christmas time of
I couldn't,
food, of energy. It's also Christmas lights, decorations, trees are up 15%,
I couldn't agree
wreaths
more.
are up
It's a seri-
15%.
I couldn't agree more.
across
It's
the
a serious problem. The question is what's causing it, and all the data indicates that federal spending is not the cause. It's supply chain, it's energy costs, it's a whole lot of other factors, not to mention excessive profits by most of our larger corporations.
And I would agree with the chairman, with my distinguished colleague from Maine, that energy cost as a result of this administration's ongoing attacks at affordable American energy continue to contribute to the massive inflation that Americans are suffering under today.
We don't want
Thank
to
you,
expend
Mr.
any more
Chairman.
energy on this energy concern. And with that, we'll go to Senator Cassidy.
Thank you. Mr. Boudreaux, nice to see you. On the orphan well program, to follow up a little bit on what Senator King asked about, I know the initial grants have been sent out, but the formula funding has not been yet received. My Louisiana Department of Natural Resources is saying kind of the delay in that being received could decrease the economy of scale of doing a big contract at once as opposed to multiple small contracts. When will that Formula One grant funding actually go out for the orphan well program?
So among other things, extremely focused on getting that funding out and getting the formulas out. So that will happen early next year.
First quarter?
Hopefully first quarter, yes. We're quite focused.
I hope to have a Merry Christmas, but I'm looking at the probability. What is the probability it'll be out first quarter?
I think it's a good probability it'll be out first quarter.
Still kind of wiggle words. I don't mean to be offensive, but that's just,
And again, not to make excuses, sir, like, part of what we are doing is, especially on this program, we're standing up a major program from scratch. And I do take the responsibilities that Ranking Member Barrasso described of making sure there's not leakage from the system or waste or fraud, and that we have the controls in place. And so over the past year, we have been focused on standing up a brand-new program, but ensuring that the right controls are in place around it.
sounds good. I thank you for the elaboration. Let me switch a little bit to a different coastline, then I'll come back to mine. Alaska. The administration recently spoke about, had published a decision memo, which included a royalty rate surcharge of 2.5% to account for the social cost of upstream greenhouse gas emissions from the production in the Cook Inlet. I'm told this decision memo said, quote, as lessees internalize the cost associated with carbon emissions, OCS activity and corresponding production could move towards a lower but more socially optimal level. On the left and the right, we just agreed that high energy costs are contributing to inflation. Clearly, domestic production can address that. But here, the internal memo is speaking about moving to a lower level of production. Now, I sent a letter to Secretary Holland in September, still have not received a reply. I wished I had received it last night, but I have not. What does the administration consider to be a socially optimal level of production, and where is that defined in the law?
So I don't think, you know, the interpretation of that statement is that the administration has in mind a socially optimal level of production, but rather presentation on the social cost is an important piece of information for the public to understand the full costs of fossil fuel development.
Let me stop you. That begs the question then, I have limited time, I'm sorry. It begs the question, does the administration or the department believe that it is more socially optimal for Venezuela or OPEC nations to create more oil, to produce more oil for U.S. consumption? Because that's really the trade-off here. So do you have a socially optimal analysis of Venezuela or other OPEC nations versus domestic production?
So I'm not familiar with any statements from the administration along those lines, Senator.
Can you share a copy with the committee of the decision memo where the department describes the rationale for the royalty increase? I'm told this is foilable, but I'd rather not foilable it. I'd rather receive it.
I'm happy to follow up on that request.
Now, because the Deepwater Gulf leases already pay 18.75% royalty, will the department be including the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions in the bid requirements, rentals, or other fees for Gulf operators? And if so, when, where?
So under, again, through implementation of the IRA, we have not included a social cost of carbon factor in any of those rental, royalty, or fees.
And do not anticipate doing so?
No, we use the social cost of carbon as a tool, again, as a disclosure tool, but we have not used,
Okay, I got you. Thank
used
you.
it in connection with.
And lastly, just to put a nail in this coffin, previously the department had said that there was a no lease option. We've talked about how the IRA requires lease sales in order to get wind, but at times the administration says one thing and frankly does another. So are you saying that indeed there will be a lease sale, that the no lease option will not be exercised?
So again, we're implementing the IRA mandates in addition to releasing the leases for 257, 2 lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico, and we are implementing that.
So there will not be a no lease sale option exercise, correct?
We are implementing the law which requires those lease sales, and we are in the process of finalizing the next 5-year plan. And part of the consideration is the requirements of the law that there essentially be Gulf of Mexico lease sales in order to also implement our offshore wind programs.
Thank you, I yield.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Secretary Boudreaux, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us. And let me just say thank you for always being responsive to my calls, particularly for helping us with the expansion of the Naval Air Station Range. I really appreciate your work there.
Absolutely, and truly, thank you for all of your work, including with the tribes to, fingers crossed. I think we've been very responsive, so thank you.
Thank you. Let me jump to water issues and the drought. In 2019, I sponsored the legislation in the Senate to enact the Colorado River Drought Conservation Plan. And in the infrastructure package, we included $300 million to implement that plan. Also included within the infrastructure package was a piece of legislation that Congresswoman Susie Lee and I worked together on, which dedicated about $450 million for the competitive grant program managed by the Bureau of Reclamation to create a large-scale water recycling project that, as you well know, would have a benefit to serve more than 500,000 households in Southern California and Nevada. Secretary Boudreaux, can you provide me with an update on how the Bureau of Reclamation is implementing these measures?
Yes, absolutely. And again, one of the more exciting provisions under the law for all the reasons you said around the benefits with water recycling. So the Bureau of Reclamation on November 3rd published the guidelines for qualification under this program. That's the key sort of step in terms of getting projects through the door to accomplish the goals of this provision. So on November 3rd, again, published the guidelines for implementation.
Thank you. And then similarly, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there was an inclusion of $4 billion for the Bureau of Reclamation to be used for Western drought assistance. I had sent a letter to the department asking them to detail how they plan to utilize those funds as well. And particularly had asked the administration to deliver a detailed plan within 90 days of sending that letter. Can you speak to the status of those funds?
Yes. This is one of the key tools that we have in order to address the severe crisis on the Colorado River. Bureau of Reclamation has put out an RFP seeking proposals to access those funds. We have a number of goals around that, including the long-term water efficiency improvements that Senator Heinrich mentioned. I will be at CRUA later this week to talk specifically about these funding opportunities and our goals coming out of it. And so we haven't dictated particular levels. We want states and water districts to come forward with proposals to wring as much opportunity out.
So not a set of strict guidelines like previously with the funding under the bipartisan infrastructure package. This funding is more of a combination of some guidelines, but you're looking for states to come forward as well?
Correct.
Okay.
We're trying to use it as an incentive for states to come forward and reward conservation in that way.
Okay, thank you. And then I want to go back to staffing, not just in our national parks. As you well know, Nevada relies on BLM partnership just because over 80% of the land is owned by the federal government, most of that managed by BLM. In recent discussions with stakeholders from my home state of Nevada, I continue to hear that BLM does not have enough staff to just even address the pre-existing work that is out there. Can you touch on that? Is it an issue of not enough resources to hire staff, or the challenge of actually finding the bodies that are interested in the work?
So I couldn't agree more, Senator. This is one of the major challenges that we have across the department, including the Bureau of Land Management. And I spent a good deal of time talking with State Director Raby about exactly this issue. Part of it is cost of living and the challenges associated with living in Reno these days, for example. And so we are trying to come up with innovative solutions to streamline onboarding. I am encouraged that OPM has committed to being a good partner in trying to provide us with streamlined ability to onboard folks. But it is a tight labor market, including in Nevada, and it is one of the challenges we face.
So when you talk about the cost of living issues in Reno, it's going to happen across the country. So are you looking at wage increase as well, or the ability to do so, or that's a combination of things that and do you have the ability to implement that if need be?
So we are trying to be as competitive as possible, including for particular types of positions, trying to work with OPM on direct hire authority to onboard people as rapidly as possible and compete with labor markets. We're also trying to take advantage of expertise from across the Bureau of Land Management in order to meet priorities, including, for example, in Nevada with renewable energy permitting.
Thank you. And I know my time is up, but let me just say, for just the existing work that needs to be done, and I think we need to streamline the permitting process. I think that is so important. But just the existing work that needs to be done is a challenge because of the lack of resources when it comes to just bodies for the BLM workers there as well. So whatever you need, whatever challenges you're facing, if there's a way that Congress can help, please, I would hope that you would reach out.
I appreciate that very much.
Senator Hyde-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Boudreau, for being here today and discussing these with us, because this bill's implementation is really critical to the state of Mississippi. As I understand it, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act set a one-year time frame for the Department of Interior to create regulations on granting leases, easements, or right-of-way of the Outer Continental Shelf for long-term sequestration of carbon dioxide, and that BOEM and BSEE are working to draft the regulations for public comment. Would you please provide us a status update on where the department is with those regulations, and when can we expect to see the guidance on that?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And this is a really crucial provision in the law that, again, I think can provide enormous benefits and take advantage of the robust industry that we have in the Gulf of Mexico to accomplish carbon sequestration. The Bessie and BOEM are focused on developing these regulations. The timeline under the infrastructure law is very aggressive, and as you pointed out, we're behind that timeline. But this is, from a regulatory perspective, one of our highest priorities, and we will have the draft regulations out this coming year with the idea of finalizing those regulations as quickly as possible.
This coming year is in 2023?
Yes.
Okay. And going back off of the conversation with Senator Cassidy, would you please explain the socially optimal standard?
Again, not being completely familiar with, the quote he pulled out on that point, I will restate: the administration does not have, a preconceived socially optimal standard for oil and gas production, and so the social cost of carbon is used as a disclosure tool to provide the public with information about, the full potential impacts of oil and gas activity, but there's not a preconceived, socially optimal level that we work towards.
Okay, well, can you tell me where the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act directs the Interior Department to try to create socially optimal levels of oil production? And where is socially optimal defined in the law or in regulations? Where can we find that so we can decide what this is?
There's not such a provision under OXLA that I'm aware of.
At all?
No, not as you described, no.
The proposed program includes these two lease sales in 2024. As part of any final record of decision or programmatic EIS, the department also publishes a multi-state EIS for the individual lease sales. And I am told the department has not even issued the notice of intent for the multi-sales EIS, which makes it difficult to know if you will even have lease sales in 2024. What is the status of the multi-sale EIS for 2023 through 2028 offshore program?
Yeah, so as I discussed earlier, we are implementing the IRA, which means we will implement 2 Gulf of Mexico lease sales in 2023 as required by the law. We are also in the process within BOEM looking at the analyses necessary both to finalize the 5-year program, but not predetermining what's in that program. And so, we have not publicly moved forward with, what used to be called the multi-sale EIS for the program that has yet to be finalized.
Okay, thank you. I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Deputy Secretary Boudreau, for being here today. Also for visiting our state. We appreciate having you come up there. The first thing I want to ask you about, though, is the permitting for the Center Mine, which supplies coal to the Milton R. Young power plant. That's a 700-megawatt plant. Now, this plant's undertaking what's called Project Tundra, which will be one of the largest carbon capture projects in the world. The intent is to store 4 million metric tons of CO2. So it's a very large carbon capture project. And right now there's a new federal mine plan in front of Laura Daniel Davis at the Department of Interior. And it's been under environmental review for 17 months. And the Center Mine and Milton R. Young Power Station need to get a resolution of that, and they really need it by the end of the year. Otherwise, they have to move, one of these huge drag lines, and that'll cost them, I think, well over $30 million just to go to a different place to mine. And of course, then it also penalizes other coal in the area that isn't federal coal. It's owned by private individuals. And so what can you do to make sure that this gets advanced after already 17 months of review, holding up and costing a lot of money to a power plant that is actually undertaking one of these huge carbon capture projects? So they're making the investment to do this, and you're impairing their ability to do it by not getting this done in a reasonable time.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the question, Senator. I am aware of this project as well as Project Tundra and the opportunity with the Energy Department on a really sort of innovative and exciting CCS program with respect to this project specifically. Part of the challenge, and again, I don't want to sound like I'm making excuses, but part of the challenge is making sure that our analyses can withstand judicial scrutiny. We've had a number of approvals from the BLM as well as OSM attacked and vacated in courts around sort of coal expansions. And so part of the process we've been going through, and unfortunately it has taken time, is working with our solicitor's office to ensure that we have appropriate NEPA coverage on the mine expansion. But it is an issue that I'm focused on. I know, as you mentioned, Laura is focused on, as well as OSM.
Will you commit to expedite or helping expedite getting it done?
Yeah, I am focused on it.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary. And the next is a lot of the flaring that we see occurring in North Dakota, and I think the chairman referred to it earlier, and he's not wrong about it, is on the reservation. And the key there is, what can you do to help them get expedited permits so they can capture that methane? They want to do it, but they got to have the gathering systems to do it. And we can't, in the state, we can't permit those. That has to be federally permitted. That's why they have higher flaring.
Yeah, no, fair enough, and agree that part of our challenge in ensuring that methane is captured and brought to market is an infrastructure issue with these gathering lines.
But, and again, that goes to this new rule that was put forward where you have, split ownership of land, and it contemplates delaying flaring where you have federal minerals alongside private minerals. So you're also disenfranchising, again, private ownership. So, look, this is one where you can actually help individuals who have, private ownership along with the federal ownership, a split estate in that respect, but also reduce flaring. I mean, these companies want to do the flaring and get more natural gas at a time when we need more natural gas to help bring down energy costs, which is a key component of inflation.
agree, and also acknowledge that split estate is a particularly acute issue in North Dakota.
Yeah, we have a checkerboard setup. So I know you've been out there to see it. We appreciate it, but we need your, efforts here now to help us, get these things done.
Understand.
The last piece is the administration has only leased 126,000, a little over 126,000 acres. That's the fewest for an administration since the 1940s. So they are holding this up. What can you do, or what are you willing to do to help us get more of these leases in place? And remember, it's one thing to have a lease. It's another to get the permit to actually drill it.
Yeah.
And so we've got to get those permits.
Yeah, thank you. And, as I mentioned previously, under the IRA, there is a new framework for us to work under. Tracy Stone Manning and the BLM are very focused on implementation within that framework. Of course, there's a period of adjustment, but we are moving forward.
Yeah. Again, we need your efforts, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Secretary Boudreau, thank you for testifying today. We've spoken before about the mega drought that's affecting the Colorado River. We're facing the worst hydrological conditions in perhaps over 1,000 years. And the department and the 7 basin states have some tough choices ahead, as you know. And all parties, need to work together, on this to figure out the conservation and the augmentation of water on the river. The infrastructure law provides unprecedented resources for this. $8.3 billion for Western water infrastructure and aquatic ecosystem restoration. The department should be forward-leaning in using this funding for drought resiliency in the Colorado River Basin. The infrastructure bill was signed into law about 1 year ago. So does the department have enough staffing so that funding for things like the Water Smart grants, for aging infrastructure projects, for water recycling and desal are quickly deployable in the Colorado River Basin?
As with BLM, with the Bureau of Reclamation, staffing is an issue. In order to implement these funding opportunities through the Bureau of Reclamation, we are focused on bringing on board about 400 new staff into reclamation. To date, we brought on about a quarter of that. And so not where we want to be, but for all the reasons you described, one of our priorities is having the staff available to implement.
What's the timeline for the additional 300 staff members?
So it's taking us, the past year to bring on about a quarter of it. We think we have, the positions described and the structure for it that I'm hopeful we can substantially close the gap in the coming year.
Any particular area that's more hard to find individuals?
As you know, given the technical challenges around this and the specialties of the Bureau of Reclamation, finding qualified engineers and folks who understand the hydrology is a challenge.
Yeah. All right. Another question about the Glen Canyon Dam. Actually, Grand Canyon and Glen Canyon Dam. So Grand Canyon National Park, as you know, is not isolated from the effects of this drought. And I understand the Department of Interior operates a collaborative science-based program to protect native fish species and natural beaches in the Grand Canyon. It involves releasing water from Lake Powell using the bypass tubes of Glen Canyon Dam. And that program is a challenging balancing act because the water is needed for storage and hydropower generation. But that water is also needed to protect the ecosystem of the Grand Canyon. We secured funding for aquatic ecosystem mitigation, including $50 million specifically for this Grand Canyon program. So is the department planning to implement high flow experiments this year? And is the infrastructure law funding available for protecting the Grand Canyon and mitigating the impacts of those releases?
So we have, as you said at the very outset, we have, very difficult decisions in front of us in the coming year that are going to be largely dictated by the hydrology. And so Bureau of Reclamation and the department has not predetermined any use at this point, including, high flow experiments. That said, for all the reasons you described, the ecosystem within the Grand Canyon is an important priority for the department. And so part of the conversation that we're going to be taking into CRUA later this week is how to have a sustainable system that generates power, provides water necessary for a host of services, including agriculture, but also can sustain ecosystems, including in the Grand Canyon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Boudreau, the Title IX of the Infrastructure Act contains funding for water projects. The key parts of the new funding for the public safety have been slow to roll out. This is a concern for me because I think other less immediate priorities have moved forward. And the area I'm focusing on is the Bureau of Land Management's fiscal year 2023 spending plan references the Laprelle Dam in my home state of Wyoming, Converse County. The state has said the dam, which is built under the CARE Act, is in a serious threat to the public, and it needs to be replaced. Of the $100 million for the repair or replacement of CARE Act dams, only $5 million is in the Bureau's spending plan. But the money is there. Do you believe it is urgent for the department to distribute funds for dams that are a serious threat to public safety?
Absolutely. Dam safety is one of our highest priorities.
Do you know if there's some justification for not distributing the funds for the dam repair and replacement in a quicker manner?
I can look into a particular project, and we'll follow up on that.
Would very much appreciate hearing back from you. Thank you. And then during Thanksgiving week, the Bureau of Land Management released 7 new policies on oil and gas leasing and permitting. Taken together, these policies give Bureau officials even more opportunities to block oil and gas leasing and permitting. For example, they now have the discretion not to lease acreage because it is not near existing oil and gas production. These officials will also be able to add new lease requirements at will. Is it fair to say that these policies are intended, as you put it, to fundamentally change the oil and gas leasing program?
So the purpose of those policies is to facilitate implementation of the leasing programs, including consistent with the IRA. For a host of reasons, giving land managers direction to focus on the highest potential areas is a priority. I think it's where the most interest is. It's a way to encourage production, but it's not meant to be a blanket exclusion either.
I'm going to follow what some Senator Langford started on, and he was talking about minerals, critical minerals. Our adversaries, specifically China, controls the world's supply in terms of the supply chains of critical minerals. With mineral demand expected to grow dramatically, specifically electric vehicles, the critical minerals there, our dependence on China is going to also increase. I think it's not too late to reduce this vulnerability, but we need to look at our resources here at home, and Senator Langford made reference to it. Estimated that over half of the federal lands are already off limits to mineral production. The Biden administration has made this situation worse. It's withdrawn over 2 million acres from mineral production. Given our dependence on China, how do we continue, or how does the administration continue to justify withdrawing federal lands from mineral production?
Critical mineral development is a priority of the administration. You've seen that through the president announcing various initiatives, including domestic sourcing of critical minerals for battery production. one of the challenges we have, which I know you're familiar with, is the 1872 mining law. And so I would be and this would be included in the report called for under the bill, will be very interested in working with this committee and with Congress on how to equip us better to lease for critical minerals.
Yeah, it just seems that we have seen over the last number of years technology evolving in ways that make previously unrecoverable resources now accessible. We've done amazing things protecting the environment, getting to resources. So, I just worry how we account for the possibility that these lands, which have now been withdrawn, will be withdrawn permanently and could impact our ability to get things later that we're clearly going to need as a nation.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. And again, think having improved authorities with the department to avoid conflicts would be extremely useful in critical mineral development.
Thank you, Senator. I'll follow up just real quick. The 5-year leasing plan, I'm really concerned about the 5-year. It's supposed to go through 24 to 29. It's supposed to be done, I think, by next year. We should have it by this time next year. Do you know where we are on that, if it's going to get done in time?
Yes, so I work on a regular basis with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on this issue. Because the Inflation Reduction Act includes lease sales through
Oh, you done?
September.
I know the Cook Inlet's been done, right?
Yeah, Cook Inlet's going to happen in a couple weeks. Before the end of the year, we'll have a March lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico and then a September lease sale. And we're working towards finalizing the plan
For the 5-year.
Based on that schedule.
Yeah, they all know the urgency of that and how important it is, basically, for us to have continuing production that we're truly dependent upon. Used guidelines, references called preference criteria of how you decide acreage will be offered onshore leasing. I think is what you all put out. It's important and helpful for both oil and gas developers and public to know the BLM has a clear and consistent criteria for deciding. However, what we're understanding is that basically any acreage, even though it has high potential, gets designated as low priority if it's not close to an existing oil or gas field. Is that accurate?
No, I think, part of what the guidance is meant to accomplish, again, is focusing on areas that can be brought into production as quickly as possible. And so part of those criteria are, the geology potential, but also proximity to infrastructure is a relevant consideration.
What it says here, Thomas, says in particular, in states that all acreage will be assigned a low priority for leasing if it is not located near existing oil and gas production. That's your new guidance.
Yeah, and again, setting priority around resource potential as well as proximity to infrastructure is meant to encourage focus on prospective areas.
But I'm saying if we're still developing, we're still depending on so much energy coming from our federally owned lands, if you will. And if there's not, and if we don't have any more production or any more high reservoirs in areas that have already been produced, and we've got to move from there. I guess the infrastructure being built and whatever it takes to get that to market is going to be a factor into that. But to leave it stranded is not going to be an answer either.
I understand. It's a matter of priority.
Yeah. Again, I think that people need to realize that the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the IRA are all in succession, a combination of one, trying to get energy security in our nation to be able to be independent and be secured. National security is based upon energy security. And for us being the superpower of the world, we're trying to use all of the above. Every administration has a different priority of how they look at energy and how we're going to be developing it. But if we're doing the best that we possibly can in the cleanest way possible, I think that that's going to be the success of what we're going to have over other countries. I'm concerned about when I say what happened in Europe right now, especially with Germany. They went down that path of thinking that, well, we'll just eliminate our way to a cleaner environment. And now they're almost throwing caution to the wind on any environmental oversight because they need any form of energy they can to keep their citizens from freezing or starving or whatever. It's just awful. We can't afford to go down there. But it says, we directed the BOEM to issue the rules needed to implement programs by last month, but not even a proposed rule has been issued yet, and that's on the Offshore Environment Office of Vast Benefit CO2, the capturing of the CO2 in that. We think it has a great promise, and I don't know if it's just something that we're not going to go down, we don't think it's worthwhile, or if it's too much of a challenge.
No, absolutely not. I think that is one of the more exciting provisions in the law. BOEM and BSEE are committed to that rulemaking. I think it has enormous potential, including for the Gulf of Mexico. It is a complex undertaking to reorient our programs for putting stuff in rather than taking it out. So we do intend to complete that rulemaking.
With that, we're going to wrap this up, and I just want to say that all the members will have until tomorrow to offer any other questions they'd like to have in the record. And we just want to thank you for coming and being, I think, very informative and very direct. And I think there's still some couple concerns you might have to follow up with some of the senators that had questions with you today that have not got adequate answers or timely answers. If you could do that, be greatly appreciated. And with that, committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Chair.